The airport hummed with its usual blend of urgency and monotony. Overhead announcements called for last-minute boardings. Luggage wheels clattered against polished floors. And the scent of strong coffee lingered near the terminals. Among the sea of travelers, Daniel Walker sat quietly in his wheelchair at Gate 14. His dark, neatly pressed blazer and military cap spoke of a man who had lived a disciplined and dignified life. His weathered hands rested calmly on his lap, his posture straight despite the chair beneath him. He wasn't in a rush. At 76, Daniel had learned the art of patience. His destination was Washington, D.C., where he was to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award for his service in the armed forces, a recognition long overdue but still welcome. As he waited, he took in the rhythm of the terminal, families jostling to keep children close, businesspeople typing furiously on laptops, and the occasional weary traveler dozing on an uncomfortable chair. Daniel had no interest in the chaos. He found peace in observation, in the way life continued to unfold with or without his participation. Yet, even in his quiet corner, he felt the faint prickle of eyes on him. It wasn't new. He had felt it all his life. People noticed his skin before they noticed the man beneath it. Even in the supposed anonymity of a crowded airport, those unspoken judgments lingered like static in the air. "Sir, can I help you with anything?" A young airport attendant approached him, her tone overly bright, her smile practiced. "No, thank you," Daniel replied evenly. "I'm fine." Her smile faltered, and she hesitated before moving on. Daniel exhaled softly. He wasn't ungrateful for the offer. It was the assumption behind it that weighed on him. He wasn't helpless. His wheelchair was a tool, not a condition. Yet some people couldn't seem to separate the two. Boarding was called, and Daniel joined the line, wheeling himself forward with steady precision. He handed his ticket to the flight attendant at the gate, a tall woman with sharp features and an air of impatience. Her name tag read, Chloe Bennett. She scanned his ticket, her eyes flicking to his wheelchair. "You need assistance getting to your seat?" she asked. Her voice tight, her politeness forced. "No, thank you," Daniel said, meeting her gaze. Her lips thinned, and she handed back his ticket without another word. As Daniel maneuvered through the narrow aisle toward his assigned seat, he caught her lingering stare. It wasn't concern. It was something colder, sharper, a quiet irritation. As though his very presence were an inconvenience. Daniel had encountered people like Chloe before. The uniform and setting might change, but the tone, the look, they remained the same. He had long stopped trying to change their minds. You couldn't argue with a lifetime of assumptions. Settling into his seat, Daniel adjusted his blazer and looked out the window. The world beyond the glass felt distant, detached, a reminder that some battles couldn't be fought with medals or service records. As the plane began to fill, he turned his attention to the soft buzz of conversation around him. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just moments to ground himself, to remind him that not everything carried the weight of meaning. But then he heard it. A low murmur from a row behind him. Words that weren't meant for his ears but found him anyway. "They always need something extra, don't they?" The voice was muffled, but the intent was clear. Daniel didn't turn around. He didn't react. He simply adjusted his posture and folded his hands neatly on his lap. The words slid off him like rain on a waxed coat, leaving only the faintest trace behind. As the cabin crew prepared for takeoff, Daniel closed his eyes briefly. He thought of his son, Ethan, piloting this flight. Ethan's pride in his father had been palpable when they spoke last night. "You deserve this award, Dad," he'd said. "You deserve more than this." Daniel hadn't disagreed, but he also hadn't allowed himself to dwell on what he deserved or didn't deserve. Life had never rewarded him for dwelling. The plane shuddered as it began to taxi, and Daniel opened his eyes again. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the tarmac. It was a fleeting beauty, one that Daniel didn't take for granted. For now, it was enough. Above him, Chloe's voice came over the intercom, brisk and professional. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard Flight 127 to Washington, D.C. We'll be departing shortly." Daniel leaned back in his seat, his expression calm but unreadable. The journey ahead was more than just miles in the air. He knew that much. What he didn't know, what he couldn't predict, was how this flight would test the very dignity he had spent his life cultivating. The plane hummed with the familiar drone of flight, a sound that could lull even the most restless traveler into quiet contemplation. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight attendants began their service, moving up and down the aisles with the practiced precision of those accustomed to navigating narrow spaces. Daniel Walker sat quietly in his seat, his gaze fixed out the small window. Beyond the thick glass, the clouds stretched endlessly, painted in the pale hues of twilight. There was something calming about the view, a reminder of perspective. From up here, the world below felt small, its noise and divisions distant, irrelevant. Yet, even at 30,000 feet, Daniel knew better than to believe he could leave those divisions entirely behind. "Would you like anything to drink, sir?" The question came from a young flight attendant, her tone polite but indifferent, her focus already shifting to the next passenger before Daniel could respond. "Just water, please," he said softly. She handed him a plastic cup, barely making eye contact, and moved on. Daniel didn't take it personally. He'd long accepted that the world didn't see him the way he saw himself. Where he saw a lifetime of service, others saw a wheelchair. Where he carried quiet dignity, others projected assumptions. As he sipped the water, he noticed Chloe Bennett approaching. Her sharp gaze flickered over him, not with curiosity but with something colder, a disdain she didn't bother to conceal. She paused near his row, her lips pressing into a thin line as if his presence were an affront. "Is everything all right?" she asked, though her tone suggested the opposite. It wasn't a question so much as an accusation wrapped in thin civility. "Yes," Daniel replied evenly. "Thank you." She lingered, her eyes narrowing. "Are you sure? You people always seem to need something extra." The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Daniel turned to look at her, his expression calm but unreadable. "I'm fine," he said, his voice measured, as if he hadn't heard the venom beneath her words. But he had. So had the passengers nearby. A young woman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze darting between Daniel and Chloe. Others avoided looking altogether, their silence speaking volumes. Daniel felt the weight of their discomfort, their unwillingness to intervene, but he didn't fault them for it. He had seen this before, the subtle erosion of dignity disguised as politeness. The quiet complicity of those who would rather not get involved. Chloe, emboldened by his silence, leaned in closer, taking up space, expecting sympathy. Pathetic. The words were sharp, meant to cut, but Daniel didn't flinch. Instead, he straightened in his seat, his hands resting calmly on his lap. "Excuse me?" he asked, his tone even, his voice low. "You heard me," she snapped, her face a mask of smug certainty. And then, without warning, her hand lashed out, striking him across the cheek. The sound of the slap was startling in the otherwise quiet cabin. A moment that seemed to stretch far longer than it lasted. Gasps rippled through the rows, heads turning in shock, eyes wide with disbelief. Chloe stepped back, her breathing quick, as if the act had surprised even her. Daniel's cheek stung, but his expression remained composed. He looked up at her, his gaze steady, unshaken. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice calm but firm, like a father chastising a child. Chloe smirked, though the confidence in her face faltered for just a moment. "What are you going to do about it?" she sneered, folding her arms. From the row behind, the soft chime of a phone camera interrupted the tense silence. The young woman who had shifted uncomfortably earlier was now standing, her phone pointed squarely at Chloe. "Everyone saw what you did," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "And this? This is going viral the second we land." The cabin buzzed with murmurs as passengers began to whisper among themselves. Some craned their necks to see better, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Chloe's confidence visibly crumbled as the reality of the moment set in. Her sharp features softened with panic, and she stumbled backward, her gaze darting to the other flight attendants for support. They didn't meet her eyes. Instead, one of them hurried toward the back of the plane, her expression tight with discomfort. Daniel remained seated, unmoving. He didn't look at Chloe or the passengers or the young woman with the phone. He simply adjusted his posture, turning his gaze back out the window. The clouds were still there, as calm and distant as ever. From above, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," came a deep, steady voice. "I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Captain Ethan Walker. Today's flight holds special meaning for me, as we have a very important passenger on board." Daniel didn't move, but his lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. Chloe froze, her face draining of color. "My father, Daniel Walker, is with us today," the captain continued. "He's a decorated war hero. And without his sacrifices, many of us wouldn't be here. It's an honor to have him on this flight." The cabin erupted in applause, the sound breaking through the tension like a burst of sunlight through heavy clouds. Chloe's smirk was gone, replaced by a pale, stunned silence. Daniel leaned back in his seat, his cheek still faintly stinging, but his dignity untouched. "Revenge isn't always loud," he murmured to himself. "Sometimes, it's simply the truth coming to light." The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet after the applause faded. The energy in the air was heavy, laden with unspoken questions and simmering tension. Passengers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Chloe Bennett stood frozen near the aisle, her face pale and her hands clenched tightly by her sides. Whatever authority she had once carried seemed to have slipped away, replaced by the heavy weight of accountability. Daniel Walker sat unmoving in his seat, gazing out the window once more. The clouds rolled by, steady and unbothered, a reminder of the vastness of the world beyond the confines of the plane. His cheek still tingled faintly from the slap, but he showed no outward sign of pain. In truth, the sting of the slap was far less significant than the sting of what it represented, a lifetime of small indignities, each one a piece of a larger, more insidious puzzle. From the overhead speaker, Captain Ethan Walker's voice returned, calm and professional, yet carrying a subtle warmth that filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take a moment to share something personal with you." He began. His tone was steady, unhurried, as though he were having a private conversation with each passenger. "My father, Daniel Walker, is not only a decorated war hero but also the man who taught me everything I know about integrity, resilience, and grace under pressure." Daniel didn't turn his head, but a faint smile touched his lips. He could picture Ethan in the cockpit, his shoulders square, his hands steady on the controls. His son's voice was a mirror of his own, calm, deliberate, and unwavering. "I wouldn't be where I am today without his guidance," Ethan continued. "He's dedicated his life to serving this country and standing for what's right, even in the face of adversity. It's an honor to have him on board today as we make our way to Washington, where he'll receive a Lifetime Achievement Award for his service." The announcement hung in the air, reverberating through the cabin like a quiet revelation. The passengers shifted in their seats, their earlier murmurs replaced with thoughtful silence. The weight of Ethan's words wasn't lost on them. Slowly, a ripple of applause began at the front of the plane, hesitant at first, then growing into a wave that filled the cabin. The sound was warm, unifying, and undeniable. Chloe's face was a study in contrast. Her earlier confidence had dissolved entirely, leaving behind only uncertainty and a creeping sense of fear. She glanced around the cabin, but the usual solidarity of her colleagues was absent. The other flight attendants avoided her gaze, their faces carefully neutral as they moved through the aisles, collecting trays and offering quiet reassurances to passengers. In row 12, Leah Adams, the young woman who had recorded the earlier confrontation, lowered her phone briefly, her expression one of quiet triumph. She didn't say anything, but her presence was enough. She had seen everything, and now so had her camera. Daniel, for his part, remained still. He didn't clap or look around. His gaze stayed fixed on the horizon beyond the window, where the fading sunlight painted the sky in soft hues of orange and purple. The applause was not for him. Not really, not for the man he was, but for the idea of him. He understood that, accepted it. People needed symbols, and for now, he would play his part. Chloe, however, was no longer playing a role. Her earlier veneer of authority had cracked, exposing something brittle and fragile beneath. She stumbled backward slightly, her movements uncharacteristically clumsy as she turned and walked briskly toward the galley at the back of the plane. The whispers of passengers followed her, low and relentless, like an invisible tide washing against her retreating figure. From his seat, Daniel finally turned his head. He glanced briefly at Leah, who offered him a small, supportive nod, then returned his gaze to the window. There was no satisfaction in his expression, no triumph. What had happened was not a victory, but a moment of clarity, a crack in the facade that allowed truth to seep through. As the plane continued its journey through the sky, the atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. The applause had faded, but its echo lingered, creating an unspoken understanding among the passengers. They didn't know Daniel's full story, but they knew enough. They understood, if only for a moment, that the man sitting quietly in row 11 had faced battles they could scarcely imagine, and he had won. Not with anger or retaliation, but with a quiet strength that refused to be diminished. Revenge isn't always loud, Daniel murmured under his breath, repeating the thought that had passed through his mind earlier. His voice was so low that only the clouds beyond the glass could hear him. Sometimes, the truth is enough. The plane was quiet now, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet that often settled over long flights. It was a strained silence, stretched taut by what had just happened. Passengers leaned toward one another, whispering in hushed tones. Some cast glances toward Daniel Walker, their expressions a mix of curiosity and something else, perhaps guilt, perhaps admiration. Others stared at their phones, their thumbs poised over keyboards, unsure of what to say but feeling compelled to say something. Daniel sat still, his hands resting lightly on his lap, his gaze once again fixed out the window. If the murmurs around him bothered him, he gave no sign. Years of experience had taught him that the world often spoke in whispers when it thought it could avoid being overheard. He let the noise pass over him like wind over a mountain, steady and unmoving. Behind him, Leah Adams adjusted her grip on her phone. The video she had recorded just minutes earlier was still open on the screen. Paused at the moment Chloe Bennett raised her hand. Leah's jaw tightened as she replayed the scene in her mind. She hadn't meant to record anything when she boarded the plane, like everyone else. She had simply been trying to get where she was going. But when she saw what happened, her instincts took over. Now, she felt the weight of what she had captured. The knowledge that she held proof of something that might otherwise be denied or dismissed. Leah leaned toward Daniel, her voice soft but firm. "Sir, if you want me to share this, I will. The world needs to see what happened." Daniel turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. There was no anger in his gaze, only a deep, quiet understanding. He studied her for a moment, as if weighing her words, then gave her a small nod. "Do what you think is right," he said, his tone calm, almost gentle. Leah nodded back, determination flickering across her face. She shifted in her seat and began typing on her phone, her movements deliberate, purposeful. Around her, a few passengers craned their necks to see what she was doing. But no one interrupted. The air around her seemed charged, as though something significant were unfolding in silence. Meanwhile, Chloe stood at the back of the plane, her back pressed against the narrow wall of the galley. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter. Her breathing shallow and uneven. The whispers from the cabin had reached her, each word like a pinprick against her skin. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the way the air seemed to shift whenever someone looked at her. She glanced toward her fellow flight attendants, hoping for some sign of solidarity, but found none. They moved around her without speaking, their faces carefully blank. One of them, a younger woman with kind eyes, hesitated as she passed, then looked away quickly, her expression conflicted. Chloe's chest tightened. For the first time, she felt truly alone. Back in his seat, Daniel closed his eyes briefly, letting the hum of the engines fill his senses. He wasn't thinking about Chloe or the passengers or even the video Leah was preparing to share. His thoughts drifted instead to his son, Ethan. Up in the cockpit, he imagined him sitting tall in the captain's chair, his hands steady on the controls, his expression calm but focused. Daniel had always admired Ethan's quiet confidence. The way he carried himself without needing to prove anything to anyone. The intercom crackled again, breaking Daniel's reverie. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Walker," Ethan's voice said. "We'll be beginning our descent shortly. On behalf of the crew, I want to thank you for flying with us today." The tone was professional, but Daniel caught the faint undertone of pride in Ethan's words. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a thread of unspoken connection between father and son. As the plane began its gradual descent, the cabin lights brightened slightly. Passengers stirred, gathering their belongings and adjusting their seat belts. The tension in the air didn't dissipate, but it softened, replaced by a sense of inevitability. The end of the flight was near, and with it, the resolution of what had transpired. Leah finished typing and hit send. She let out a slow breath, her phone now resting on her lap. She didn't say anything, but the faint look of satisfaction on her face spoke volumes. Across the aisle, another passenger nodded at her, a silent gesture of agreement. Daniel glanced toward her once more, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He didn't need to ask what she had done. He already knew, and while he felt no joy in the thought of exposing Chloe, he understood the importance of what Leah had shared. Sometimes, the truth needed witnesses. As the wheels of the plane touched down on the tarmac, a ripple of relief passed through the cabin. Chloe remained at the back, her shoulders hunched, her face turned away. Daniel stayed seated, waiting patiently as the passengers around him began to disembark. He knew there was no rush. The world outside would still be waiting for him, as it always had. When it was finally his turn, he adjusted his blazer, straightened his posture, and wheeled himself toward the front of the plane. The other passengers stepped aside, their expressions a mixture of respect and quiet apology. Daniel acknowledged them with a nod, his movements steady, deliberate. As he passed Chloe, he paused briefly, his eyes meeting hers. She opened her mouth as if to speak but said nothing. Daniel didn't linger. He didn't need to. The moment had passed, but its weight remained, heavy and unspoken. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Daniel inhaled deeply, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now. He felt a small sense of peace. The tide had turned, and with it, the promise of something better. Small ripples, he thought, as he moved toward the terminal. That's how change begins. The plane rolled to a stop at the gate, the soft chime of the seatbelt sign fading into the low murmur of passengers gathering their belongings. The air in the cabin felt heavier than it should have, as though the events of the flight lingered in every corner, refusing to be ignored. Daniel Walker remained seated, his hands resting lightly on the arms of his wheelchair, his expression calm, unreadable. Around him, the other passengers shuffled awkwardly, their movements slower, more deliberate. From his vantage point, Daniel could see Chloe Bennett standing near the galley. She looked smaller than before, her once brisk demeanor now replaced with something tentative and uncertain. Her hands fidgeted at her sides, and her gaze darted around the cabin, avoiding any direct eye contact. She looked like someone waiting for an inevitable reckoning. The passengers began to disembark, their goodbyes to the crew noticeably subdued. A few of them paused near Daniel, offering him small nods or murmured words of support. A middle-aged man with graying hair stopped for a moment, his hand resting on the back of the seat in front of him. "Thank you for your service, sir," the man said, his voice low but steady. There was no hesitation, no performative flourish, just genuine gratitude. Daniel nodded in acknowledgement, a faint smile crossing his lips. As the last of the passengers filed out, a group of airline officials stepped onto the plane, their crisp suits and polished shoes a stark contrast to the tension that filled the cabin. Leading them was a man in his 50s with neatly combed hair and a name tag that read Mark Linton, Regional Manager. His expression was carefully composed, professional but not entirely neutral. His gaze swept over the cabin before settling on Daniel. "Mr. Walker," he said, stepping forward, "I'm Mark Linton, on behalf of the airline. I want to apologize for what happened on this flight." Daniel regarded him for a moment, his eyes steady, unflinching. He had seen men like Mark before, men skilled in the art of apology. Their words smooth and practiced, designed to diffuse tension without truly addressing it. It's not about the apology, Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made the cabin seem smaller. It's about what you're going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again. Mark hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of the statement. We have protocols in place, he began, his tone faltering slightly, but I assure you, we'll be reviewing them thoroughly to ensure. Protocols aren't enough, Daniel interrupted, his voice calm but firm. Real change requires more than words. It requires effort, commitment, and accountability. Mark shifted uncomfortably, his polished composure cracking under the pressure of Daniel's steady gaze. Behind him, a few of the flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances. Chloe stood near the galley, her face pale, her posture rigid. She didn't speak, didn't move. It was as though she were holding her breath, waiting for the inevitable judgment. I'll make sure this is addressed at the highest levels, Mark said finally, his voice carrying a note of resolve. You have my word. Daniel held his gaze for a moment longer before nodding. He knew better than to put too much stock in promises. But he also knew the power of planting a seed. Change didn't happen all at once, it started with moments like this. Quiet but significant. See that you do, Daniel said simply. Mark exhaled, a faint look of relief crossing his face. He turned to Chloe, his expression hardening. Ms. Bennett, he said, his tone clipped. You'll accompany me to my office immediately. Chloe's head jerked up, her eyes wide with fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she nodded silently and followed Mark down the aisle. Her footsteps heavy, her shoulders slumped. The other flight attendants watched her go, their faces a mixture of sympathy and resignation. Daniel waited until the aisle was clear before turning to the young woman who had recorded the incident, Leah. She stood near the exit, her phone in hand, her expression a blend of determination and uncertainty. When their eyes met, she hesitated, then stepped closer. Mr. Walker, she began, her voice quiet but steady. I wanted you to know that I've shared the video. People need to see what happened. Daniel studied her for a moment, then gave her a small nod. Thank you, he said simply. There was no need for a lengthy response. He understood her intentions, and he respected them. Leah nodded back, a faint smile tugging at her lips. You handled everything with such grace. She added, I don't know if I could have done the same. Daniel's gaze softened. Grace isn't about what you feel, he said. It's about what you choose to do with what you feel. Leah seemed to consider his words, then smiled again, more genuinely this time. Safe travels, she said, before stepping off the plane. When Daniel finally disembarked, the terminal was quieter than he expected. Ethan was waiting for him near the gate, his uniform crisp, his posture straight. The moment their eyes met, Ethan's face softened, his shoulders relaxing. Dad, Ethan said, stepping forward to take the handles of Daniel's wheelchair. His voice was low, steady, filled with quiet pride. You okay? I'm fine, Daniel replied, his tone light. You did good up there. Ethan smiled faintly, but there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes, an unspoken question. A lingering anger that he couldn't quite suppress. They deserved worse, Ethan said quietly as they moved through the terminal. Daniel didn't respond right away. He let the moment stretch. Let the rhythm of their movement fill the space. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm, measured. Anger's easy, son, he said, but it doesn't build anything. It just burns. Ethan nodded, though his jaw tightened slightly. Sometimes I don't know how you do it. You learn, Daniel said simply. You learn because you have to. And because the world doesn't change unless you show it how. As they approached the exit, the late afternoon sunlight streamed through the glass, casting long shadows across the floor. Daniel tilted his head back slightly, letting the warmth of the light touch his face. For a moment, he felt the weight of the day lift, replaced by a quiet sense of resolve. The world hadn't changed, not yet. But maybe, just maybe, it had started to. And for now, that was enough. The hotel lobby was quiet, its polished floors reflecting the warm glow of the late evening lights. Daniel Walker sat in his wheelchair near the entrance. His posture as steady as ever. He was not a man accustomed to waiting. But patience had become second nature over the years. Beside him, his son Ethan stood with his arms crossed. His sharp pilot's uniform making him look every bit the professional he was. Yet, there was a tension in his stance. A barely concealed frustration that Daniel could feel without even looking at him. "Dad," Ethan began, his voice low but firm. "You don't have to meet with him. Let the airline handle this however they want. You don't owe anyone your time." Daniel turned his head slightly, his calm eyes meeting Ethan's. "It's not about owing anyone," he said evenly. "It's about what happens next." Before Ethan could respond, the glass doors of the lobby slid open, and Mark Linton, the airline's regional manager, stepped inside. His suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted, but there was a faint unease in the way he moved. He spotted Daniel and Ethan immediately and approached with a measured gait. His hands clasped in front of him. "Mr. Walker, Captain Walker," he said, nodding at each of them in turn. His voice was smooth, polished, but there was no mistaking the tension beneath it. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Daniel gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, sit." Mark hesitated for the briefest moment before lowering himself into the chair. He set his hands on his knees, his posture straight but not rigid. He exhaled slowly before speaking again. "First, let me say how deeply sorry I am for what happened on the flight. The behavior you experienced was inexcusable. And I assure you, we've taken immediate action." Daniel nodded slightly but didn't respond. He let the silence settle between them. Let Mark feel the weight of his own words. Ethan, standing a step behind, shifted slightly, his arms tightening across his chest. Mark cleared his throat. "The flight attendant in question, Ms. Bennett, has been removed from duty pending a full investigation. We're also reviewing our training protocols to ensure." "Protocols?" Daniel interrupted softly, his tone neutral but firm. "They're always the first thing mentioned, aren't they?" Mark blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Well, yes. But they're an important step. They help us set expectations and expectations are only as good as the people enforcing them," Daniel said, leaning slightly forward in his chair. "And from what I've seen, they're not enough." Mark hesitated, his polished facade cracking just slightly. "What do you suggest, Mr. Walker?" Daniel's gaze was steady, unwavering. "Start by asking the right questions. Why did she think she could get away with it? Why did no one stop her until she'd gone too far? And why did it take passengers, strangers, to hold her accountable?" Mark opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, unsure of what to say. The silence that followed wasn't hostile, but it was heavy, filled with unspoken truths that neither man could ignore. Ethan broke the quiet, his voice sharp. "What my father's saying is, it's not just about this one incident. It's about the culture you're fostering. You can fire her, retrain your staff, make all the promises in the world, but if you don't address the underlying issue, nothing's going to change." Mark nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You're right," he admitted after a moment. "You're absolutely right. I can't fix what happened, but I can work to ensure it doesn't happen again." Daniel tilted his head slightly, considering Mark's words. "Real change doesn't come from apologies or promises," he said. "It comes from effort. Quiet, steady effort. Are you ready for that?" Mark's jaw tightened, and he nodded again, more firmly this time. "Yes, sir, I am." For the first time, Daniel's expression softened. He extended a hand, and Mark took it, his grip firm but respectful. "Then let's see what you do," Daniel said. "Words are easy. Actions take work." Mark rose from his seat, smoothing his suit jacket. "I won't let you down, Mr. Walker," he said. "You have my word." As Mark walked away, Ethan sat down beside his father, his shoulders still tense. "Do you think he meant it?" he asked. Daniel was quiet for a moment before answering. Maybe not. But what matters isn't what he meant, it's what he does." Ethan nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "It's just hard," he said finally, "seeing this happen to you, over and over, knowing it could happen to anyone. It is hard." Daniel agreed. "But you fight it by living differently. by refusing to let it define you or stop you. Ethan exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. I don't know how you stay so calm. Daniel smiled faintly. I've had a lifetime of practice. The two men sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as the city lights began to flicker on outside the lobby windows. For Daniel, the weight of the day was still present, but it no longer felt overwhelming. Change was slow, frustratingly so, but it had to start somewhere. And sometimes, a quiet conversation was all it took to set it in motion. The hotel room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Daniel Walker sat by the window, gazing out at the city below. The lights stretched endlessly into the night, tiny beacons of life moving in a rhythm he had grown accustomed to but no longer tried to follow. His military cap rested neatly on the side table, a silent marker of the journey that had brought him here. Behind him, Ethan was pacing. It wasn't frantic, but it carried an energy Daniel recognized well, anger. Tightly contained, simmering just below the surface. His son's movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as if walking back and forth could somehow untangle the knot of emotions he carried. You should have let me say more, Ethan said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was low, controlled, but there was no mistaking the edge in his tone. Back there, with that manager, he deserved to hear how wrong all of this is. Daniel turned his head slightly, his gaze calm. He already knows, he replied. There's nothing I could say that he hasn't already thought about in the quiet moments when no one's watching. Ethan stopped pacing and turned to face his father. And what if he doesn't change? What if he just keeps apologizing and nothing ever gets better? Daniel leaned back in his chair, his hands resting lightly on the armrests. Then that's on him, he said simply. But anger won't push him to change. People don't listen when they feel attacked. They listen when they feel understood. Ethan let out a frustrated breath, running a hand through his hair. It's just hard, Dad, watching you go through this. Knowing how much you've given to this country. How much you've sacrificed. And seeing people treat you like you're less than. Daniel's lips curved into a faint smile. One that didn't quite reach his eyes. Life doesn't reward you for what you've done, Ethan. It tests you for what you still have to give. Before Ethan could respond, a soft knock came at the door. He glanced at his father, who nodded for him to answer it. When Ethan opened the door, a young woman stood there, her face familiar. It was Leah Adams, the passenger who had recorded the incident on the plane. She held a small envelope in her hand, her expression tentative but earnest. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said softly. I wanted to give this to you. Ethan stepped aside, and Leah entered the room, her gaze shifting to Daniel. She walked over and handed him the envelope. I don't know if this means much, she said, her voice trembling slightly, but I wanted to say thank you. For how you handled everything. For showing strength when it would have been so easy to lose it. Daniel took the envelope and opened it carefully. Inside was a simple card, handwritten in neat, careful letters. The message was brief but heartfelt. Your dignity taught us all something today. Thank you for reminding us of what strength really looks like. Daniel read the words twice before placing the card on the table beside him. He looked up at Leah, his expression warm but reserved. Thank you, he said quietly. It means more than you know. Leah hesitated for a moment, then said, You didn't deserve what happened. No one does. But the way you handled it, I think it made a difference. For everyone on that plane. Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. Small ripples, he murmured, almost to himself. That's how change starts. One person, one moment at a time. Leah smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. I hope so, she said. Safe travels, Mr. Walker. She turned to leave, but as she reached the door, she paused and looked back. For what it's worth, she said, I shared the video. People are already talking about it. Maybe it'll start something bigger. Daniel met her gaze, his expression steady. Maybe, he said, but real change doesn't come from a single moment. It comes from what people choose to do with that moment. Leah nodded, seeming to understand. Good night, she said, and with that, she was gone. Ethan closed the door and leaned against it, his arms crossed. She's right. You know, you handled it better than anyone else could have. Daniel turned back to the window, his eyes on the city lights. It's not about handling it, he said. It's about showing people there's another way. Anger only builds walls. Grace builds bridges. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He walked over and sat on the edge of the bed, his gaze fixed on the floor. Do you think it's enough? He asked finally. Grace. Dignity. All of it. Do you think it's enough to actually change anything? Daniel was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but resolute. It has to be, he said, because if it isn't, then what's left? The room fell quiet again. But it was a different kind of silence now, less tense. More reflective. Ethan watched his father, the man who had faced more battles than anyone should, and felt a deep, abiding respect. He didn't have all the answers. But in that moment, he realized that his father's strength wasn't in fighting back. It was in refusing to let the world dictate his worth. As the night deepened, the city lights outside seemed to glow a little brighter. For Daniel, the day's events were just one chapter in a much larger story. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a quiet hope that the ripples he had created might one day become waves. The auditorium in Washington, D.C., was grand yet understated, its high ceilings and warm lighting evoking a sense of quiet reverence. Rows of chairs were filled with men and women, many in military attire, their medals gleaming faintly under the soft glow of chandeliers. It was a space meant for honor, reflection, and the kind of gratitude that couldn't always be captured in words. Daniel Walker sat in his wheelchair near the front, his military cap resting neatly on his lap. His posture was as straight as ever, his hands steady, his expression calm. Beside him, Ethan adjusted the cuff of his uniform, his eyes scanning the room. There was pride in his gaze, but also a lingering tension, as if he were bracing for something unseen. The program began with the usual formalities, introductions, speeches, a listing of accomplishments that seemed both impressive and distant, as though belonging to someone else. When Daniel's name was called, a ripple of applause spread through the room. It wasn't thunderous, but it was sincere, the kind of applause that carried a deep respect rather than mere politeness. Ethan stepped forward first, taking the handles of Daniel's wheelchair and guiding him to the stage. As they moved, Daniel felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on him, not with judgment but with quiet expectation. When they reached the podium, Ethan helped him settle into place before stepping back, his presence a reassuring anchor just behind his father. Daniel adjusted the microphone slightly and looked out at the audience. He didn't rush to speak. Instead, he let the silence settle, filling the space with a sense of gravity that no words could achieve. I'm honored to be here today, he began, his voice steady, unhurried. But as I sit before you, I find myself reflecting not on the battles I fought or the medals I've earned, but on the lessons those battles taught me. His gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of strangers and comrades alike. Courage is not loud, he said. It is not the sound of charging forward or the clash of weapons. Courage is quiet. It's the choice to stand firm in the face of adversity, to hold on to your principles when the world tries to strip them away. A faint murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Daniel paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. Recently, I was reminded of how far we still have to go, he said, his tone measured, deliberate. On a simple flight, I was treated not as a man who served this country, but as a burden, not as a veteran, but as a problem to be solved, or dismissed. The room grew still, the weight of his words settling over the audience like a heavy blanket. But I also saw something else, Daniel continued, his voice softening slightly. I saw people standing up, strangers who spoke out, who chose to bear witness rather than look away. And I was reminded that change, real change, doesn't come from grand gestures or sweeping reforms. It comes from the small moments, the quiet acts of courage that ripple outward. He glanced over his shoulder at Ethan, his expression softening. My son reminded me of that. He's always been my greatest example of what strength truly looks like. Not because he fights the loud battles, but because he carries himself with integrity in every moment. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes glistening. He looked down, the faintest of smiles crossing his lips. Daniel turned back to the audience. The challenges we face today are not new. He said, they are the same struggles that generations before us have fought, and that generations after us will inherit. But what matters is how we respond. Do we let hate and fear dictate our actions? Or do we choose to meet them with grace? With dignity? With the quiet strength that reminds the world who we are? The applause began slowly, a soft wave that built steadily, filling the room. Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging the response but not dwelling on it. This moment wasn't about him. It was about the larger truths he hoped would linger long after the applause faded. As the program concluded and the audience began to disperse, Daniel remained seated by the stage, watching as people moved past him. Some stopped to shake his hand, their expressions filled with gratitude. Others simply nodded as they passed, their respect evident in the smallest of gestures. Ethan crouched beside him, his voice low. "You did good, Dad." Daniel smiled faintly, his gaze still fixed on the room. "We did good," he said. "Every small step counts." Later that evening, back in their hotel room, the weight of the day began to settle over them. Daniel sat by the window again, the city lights stretching out before him like stars scattered across the earth. Ethan sat nearby, scrolling through his phone, his brow furrowed. "Looks like the video's everywhere now," Ethan said, holding up the screen. "It's making people talk." Daniel nodded but said nothing. He wasn't looking for validation, nor was he interested in the fleeting attention of a viral moment. What mattered to him were the ripples, the conversations, the small shifts in perspective, the seeds of change that might grow in unexpected places. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" Ethan asked, his voice quiet. Daniel turned to look at him, his expression thoughtful. "Not by itself," he said, "but it's a start, and sometimes, that's all you can hope for." As the night deepened, the room grew quiet again. The world outside continued its ceaseless rhythm. But within these walls, there was a sense of peace. For Daniel, the journey wasn't over, it never truly would be. But in this moment, he allowed himself the comfort of knowing that he had done his part, and that the rest was in the hands of those who would come after him. Small ripples, he thought, watching the lights flicker in the distance. That's how the world changes. Quietly, steadily, one moment at a time.